had to be taken care of. So we move through history then, more closer to the present time, when we deal with a man called Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence. Now, Lawrence lived in a place called Clouds Hill in Dorset, and he tried to remain as anonymous as he could. But he's the one man in British history who affronted and embarrassed the King of England, who held his magnificent ribbon to decorate him after the First World War and turned his back on the king and refused to take it. Joined the Tank Corps ultimately, and then made up his mind that he was going back to the Middle East to deal with his beloved Arabs. But beyond that, Henry Williamson, the Scottish fascist author, brought to him a letter from Adolf Hitler, who invited him to go to Berchtesgaden, because Hitler had identified Lawrence as the one man whom the British would accept as a dictator, because he was such a national hero. So Lawrence became intolerable to the realm, and he had to be eliminated. Another political assassination because MI5 hit him with a Black Maria after he had sent a telegram to Williamson saying, "Come on up for tea on Tuesday." So there goes Lawrence of Arabia, as he was called by Lowell Thomas, and as we came to know him, and he was finished. So these are examples of political assassinations that one has to keep very clearly in mind, because I've come to believe, and I don't know about my colleagues, but I've come to believe that political assassination is the last resort. If they can get rid of you one way or another, diminish you, de-emphasize your work, they'll do that. Scandals, arrests, whatever, they will do that. But if they can't get rid of you that way, and you insist on challenging and become a serious threat to whatever power structure there is, then that's where assassination comes in. I'm about to turn in later years now to what happened to Mr. Roosevelt. And I won't go into detail here, but what I have learned is staggering in terms of what really happened to Mr. Roosevelt at Warm Springs. Roosevelt had a plan of action to implement after the Second World War, at the end of his days. He could not be allowed to implement that plan, because it would have resulted in the indictments of Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, John McCloy. Go down the list of the henchmen of the forces that ruled this country. And Roosevelt was going after all of them. 30 Rockefeller Plaza, where Allen Dulles was given his rooms to work, Bill Stevenson had him wired, and the entire floor wired. And they knew that Dulles, as Arthur Goldberg has said, the Dulles brothers were serious traitors and should have been tried. And Mr. Roosevelt was going after them. So we have those kinds of situations that have emerged throughout history. There are questions about what happened to Lenin, of course, in 1924, where Stalin took over. So without dwelling on it, I just want you to understand that I firmly believe that this, and has been this historical use of political assassination throughout human society. And we shouldn't be surprised with what happened in this country in the 1960s, which my colleagues are going to talk to you about. I thought when Martin was killed in 1968, they got the right guy. And they traced him, they arrested him, they tried him. I thought they got the right guy. That was 1968. I had known him only from 1967 when I came back from Vietnam as a journalist, and Ramparts published this article of mine called The Children of Vietnam. Martin was a subscriber to Ramparts. He asked to meet with me. He wept when he saw the photographs. He wept when he saw what his government was doing. That was in February of 1967. On April 4th of 1967, he delivered his famous speech at Riverside Church, where he came out hard against the war. He then, at that point, said to me, "Can you stay with me and help develop a new politics movement?" Which I agreed, and I did. And we had a convention in Chicago with over 5,000 delegates, and we were going to launch the King's Spot ticket, which I first asked masses of people in front of the UN to consider on April 15th, 1967, 11 days after Martin delivered his speech there. How naive we were. How naive we were. I look back and it's almost laughable at how stupid we were, because we didn't realize the extent to which the government would infiltrate, subvert, and destroy a movement. So when the Black Caucus was founded at that convention in Chicago, and Martin was delivering the opening address, the keynote speech, a note gets passed to me over my shoulder: "Get him out of here, or we will take him hostage and embarrass him before the world." They had to get rid of him from that convention because he was a unifier. They had to finish him. So we had to get him out. Told Andy we had to get him out of here in order to avoid that kind of brutal embarrassment. That was being led by the Blackstone Rangers, a Chicago gang. How naive we were. So out he goes, and then that same caucus starts introducing resolutions that split the movement terribly and made sure that there would not be any effective political opposition to Lyndon Johnson. Okay, so that went on and on. And eventually, Martin decided he was going to bring 500,000 people to Washington, not to march, but to camp, and to visit the Congress, their Congress people, and try to get put back into the budget monies that were taken out of the social programs, because the war needed those monies. And the military knew that he might lose control of that, because they weren't going to get that money back. And there was going to be mounting frustration, and that could lead to the same type of revolutionary turmoil that the world saw in Paris not so long before that. Lyndon Johnson didn't have André Malraux, who was able to deal with de Gaulle and to co-opt that movement. But Lyndon was going to rely on the military and the police to suppress it. But they didn't have the troops. Westmoreland wanted 200,000 more. They didn't have the troops for that. They didn't have the troops to put down what they saw was going to be a serious revolution on the streets of Washington. So Martin King was assassinated because he opposed the war in Vietnam, but was hitting the bottom lines of a number of American corporations, and two, because he was going to bring this mass of humanity to Washington. And that could lead to the revolution. So they made up their minds early on that he had to go. So what did they do? They profiled the Missouri State Penitentiary system, at Hoover's request, and they found an ideal patsy, guy who was a con man, who was he was a convicted criminal who could be manipulated and controlled and used and moved around, and that, of course, was James Earl Ray. So they took James and they used him as the patsy. He escaped more than a year before the actual assassination. They moved him around the country. Martin was originally to have been killed in Los Angeles. They kept James in Los Angeles for a long time. The two military special ops guys who were the backup team could not kill him but with a backup team, were also housed in Los Angeles for the fateful day. The problem was, as I came to realize in later years, there was another assassination going to take place in California a couple of months after Martin, and that was, of course, the assassination of Bob Kennedy. It wouldn't do to have two of those take place in the same city. So they switched around. The military guys didn't know why they were ordered to move to New Orleans and Memphis, but they were. James was moved to New Orleans and then eventually into Memphis. And Memphis, under Frank Hulleman as director of police and fire, was where the assassination of Martin King was to take place. Whereas the line was cleared for Bob to be hit in Los Angeles when he was, as expected, he would win the Los Angeles primary. So they set that stage very well. They gave Ray credentials. They gave him a handler. The name of the handler is a fellow called Raul. People always said, oh, Raul, oh, he made this guy up. Well, Raul didn't make it. Raul wasn't made up. Raul was a real guy. He was an operative who came out of Portugal. He worked for Portuguese intelligence in Angola. He was brought into the United States. He was given a job. He did their bidding. I was eventually able to find witnesses who knew Raul. I located where he lived. He lived in Yonkers, New York, would you believe? His name was Raul Coelho. He died. Yeah, fairly recently, not so long ago, he died. But Raul was the handler for James and moved him around, gave him money, told him what to do. So they set all of this up. And I thought when Martin was killed, it was a lone nut. How naive, right? That's where my naivete stretches, I'm afraid. But I believe that they had the right guy when they got him. And I just walked away. We buried Martin. Ben Spock and I went down to Atlanta. We buried Martin. Bobby asked me to come up to his suite and talk about handling or working on his presidential campaign. And I said, no, I was through. Finished with politics. That was it for me. I walked away. 9 years later, Abernathy and I, who talked regularly over the years, and a lot of people, Abernathy said, look, I'd like you to go to the prison with me and interrogate Ray. And I said, what are you, gone around the bend? He said, no. I said, you think there's any reason why he might? He said, I don't know, but I'd like you to go. I have some uneasiness. And I didn't understand what was behind Ralph's request at that time. That's further naivete on my part. Ralph was diminishing his position in SCLC, and this was perhaps a chance for him to refurbish his own image. So I said, okay, but I don't know anything about the case. It took me 6 months to prepare. Finally, in '78, in August, we went up to the prison. I interrogated James for 5 hours. With Jim Lawson and Mark Lane, who was representing James at the time, and Ralph was there, awake most of the time, although he fell asleep. He was awake most of the time. So we finished that 5-hour session with a firm belief that James was not the shooter. I didn't know what role he might have played knowingly. Anyway, he wasn't the shooter. But he raised enough questions that I started in 1978, all those years ago, right? 1978, going into Memphis, quietly, on the streets, in the bars, talking to people who knew things that went on there. And more I learned, more and more questions became answered and new questions arose. And I would go visit James in prison. And he kept asking me to represent him. Mark took it as far as he could, and he left. So I said, no, I won't represent you until I'm sure you had nothing